Hi there, everybody. I hope you're doing well today. This video is going to start our unit on moral theory by considering some of the ideas of consequentialism and utilitarianism. We're actually going to start out the video by distinguishing between what you might call conventional morality and critical morality. Then I'm going to introduce three kinds of moral theory that attempt to explain or capture this more critical morality. And then we'll introduce utilitarianism as a specific kind of consequentialism, and then discuss some of the advantages of this kind of theory. So far this semester, we've spent most of our time talking about theories of well-being, but now that we're talking about morality, we need to understand that actions that contribute to a person's well-being will often be distinguished from an action being moral or immoral. And that's because intuitively, immoral actions might sometimes improve that person's own well-being. Someone robs a bank and gets away with it, well, that might improve their well-being, even if it is morally wrong to do. Similarly, we often think that moral actions sometimes hurt that person's own well-being. Like if you sacrifice your own life to save your child, well, you might have done a moral thing, but it came at the cost of your own well-being, cost of your own life in this case. So we want to try to come up with a theory that doesn't explain the nature of well-being, but explains the nature of moral and immoral actions. Now, there's three questions we might want an ethical theory to help us answer. So firstly, we might want to know, well, what is it that makes right acts right? And how do we know which actions are right and which actions are wrong? And why should we be moral? Why should we care about morality? But where exactly do we start? How do you build an ethical theory? Well, one strategy starts with common beliefs about examples of actions that are right and wrong. And then when we look at these examples, we can then construct principles that try to capture similarities between the examples of right actions and the examples of wrong actions, to thereby explain why the right actions are morally right. That kind of strategy starts with what's sometimes called conventional morality, where this is a system of widely accepted rules or principles that members of a culture or society use to govern their own lives and to assess the actions and motivations of others. Now, most people assume that conventional morality can be wrong. The fact that your culture or society uses a certain principle to assess people's actions doesn't mean that that principle is correct. Societies can make mistakes. However, the most plausible and widely shared ideas about morality could still provide us a starting point for thinking about morality, even if we should still take time to reflect on those ideas and even sometimes criticize those conventional ideas. And so that process might thereby help us find rules and principles that will form a critical morality as opposed to a conventional morality, where that critical morality attempts to find moral truth instead of just describing cultural preferences and opinions. What general rules do you think of when you think about morally right and morally wrong actions? Well, you might think of things like don't steal, don't kill, don't cheat, don't lie. Those actions are morally wrong. You might think you should keep your promises, be kind, be respectful. These actions seem to be morally right. And now, when we have these examples about conventional morality, we can start to ask, well, is there anything that the wrong actions seem to have in common and that the right actions seem to have in common? And that can help us come up with more general principles to explain why right actions would be right and wrong actions would be wrong. Now, there's many kinds of ethical theories, and now what I'm about to give you here are rough ideas. I'm not trying to give you definitions yet. We'll do that later on. But one approach to morality is what's known as consequentialism. Now, these kinds of theories hold that the morality of an action is determined by the extent to which it produces good and bad consequences. So the reason that it's wrong to kill is because by killing a person, it has very bad consequences. Now, deontology has a different approach where it says the morality of an action is determined by its conformity with foundational moral duties. So wrong actions, they all fail to conform to some moral duty that we have, and right actions succeed in conforming to those fundamental moral duties. Virtue theory holds that the morality of an action is determined by the extent to which it accords with virtue. So all those wrong actions, they are wrong because they all fail to accord with virtue. We're going to start out by looking at a specific version of consequentialism. One influential and simple version is what's known as act utilitarianism. This is the view that an action is morally required if and only if it does more to improve overall well-being than any other action you could have done in the circumstances. The idea here is that an action is morally right if it maximizes overall well-being. Now, if some actions are tied for producing the most overall well-being, then any of them would be right. We judge the morality of the individual action by the consequences that that individual action has, and specifically on the consequences that the action has for the overall well-being that exists in the world. It's important to consider some clarifications about what utilitarianism says about morality. For starters, on this view, the intentions behind the action are irrelevant to whether the action is right or wrong. While the intentions might be relevant to how we assess or evaluate the morality of the person, they are not relevant to the morality of the action. People can sometimes do the right thing for the wrong reasons. So they might do the thing that has really good consequences overall, that maximizes well-being, but they might do it for very selfish reasons. In which case, we might say their intentions mean that even though they did the right thing, because of their intentions, maybe they're a bad person, they're a selfish person. So their intentions are relevant to how we evaluate them as a person, but not to how we evaluate their actions on this view. It's also important to keep in mind you need to consider both the good and the bad that results from the action that you're evaluating. You can't just say, hey, look at all this good I did, because something that does a lot of good might also have the side effect of causing a lot of bad. And we need to add up the good and take away the bad to figure out the overall effect that it has on well-being. Moreover, it's really important to make sure you consider how much the action helps a specific person or how much it harms a specific person, and not just how many people it helps or harms. Utilitarianism doesn't say that the action that benefits the majority of people is going to be the right action. Sometimes you can increase the overall well-being that exists in the world more by helping a smaller amount of people. The example I like to give is, imagine that you have to decide what to do with some money at a university, and you decide you're going to use it as scholarship money. You might divide that scholarship money amongst all the students so that every student gets a benefit, but then no individual student will get very much. Or we could focus that money and try to give it to the students that are most in need, and so they get a lot more money, and that might make a much bigger difference. Because now it might mean the difference between being able to stay in school or having to drop out, getting a degree or not. Now, by making sure that people are able to finish their degree, the overall good that is done is greater than the overall good you could have done by giving a little bit of help to a greater number of students. Maximizing utility or maximizing well-being is not necessarily the same thing as helping as many people as you can. It's also important to keep in mind that the calculation of how much overall good results from your action needs to give equal consideration to everyone's well-being. It's not just about doing what's going to make you the happiest or increase your well-being the most. And it's not about what you can do to increase just the well-being of those around you or your friends and family the most. You have to give equal weight to strangers' well-being as you give to your own well-being. So this leads directly into the advantages of the utilitarian kind of theory. It appears as if utilitarianism has a kind of impartiality. Impartiality means not biased. In the same way you want an impartial judge of a sporting event. You don't want the judge to be biased in favor of one competitor rather than another. You want the judge to be able to objectively determine which competitor performs the best. So that's why you wouldn't allow the parent of a competitor to be a judge, because their emotional connection to their own child might thereby prevent them from being able to give that kind of objective assessment. Similarly, when we think about the morally right action to perform, we might want morality to give an objective assessment about which action is the best, without taking into consideration or giving preference to one person or group's well-being or feelings rather than another. And so in this way, utilitarianism says that everybody's well-being needs to be given equal consideration. Now, this idea that everybody's well-being gets equal consideration regardless of their race, their sex, their religion, their nationality, might seem especially attractive when you think about history and the ways in which people have promoted bad moral ideas that didn't give equal consideration to people's well-being from different races, sexes, religions, and nationalities, etc. Moreover, if you look at the history here, this kind of impartiality that everybody's well-being has to be given equal consideration helped a lot of utilitarians challenge or criticize the conventional morality of their time, that thereby led to society making moral progress in a number of ways. Another advantage here is that utilitarianism can provide an explanation for a lot of our common sense moral beliefs. Almost everyone now strongly believes that actions such as slavery, rape, and killing innocent people are seriously immoral. Now, utilitarianism agrees with at least these aspects of common sense. But more than that, utilitarianism can offer an explanation for why those actions are wrong. The utilitarian doesn't just need to stomp their foot and say, it's wrong because I say it's wrong. They don't need to leave these as unargued assumptions. The utilitarian can justify these beliefs by giving arguments that show the suffering that these actions cause, thereby showing why they're wrong. Utilitarianism, when it gives that kind of justification, that explanation, it seems to be a rather simple and unified explanation for why all these actions are morally wrong. The explanation is the same in every scenario. You don't give one explanation in one case and a different explanation in another. And just like in the sciences, we might prefer an ethical theory that gives a simple unified explanation rather than a theory that gives like 10 different explanations that don't seem to connect up in any other way. Another one of the major advantages of utilitarianism is what's known as its moral flexibility here. Utilitarianism does not issue absolute moral rules. There's one exception to this, though, as we'll see. Now, the idea is utilitarianism allows, it justifies, it explains why we can break a lot of these conventional moral rules. So, yes, you shouldn't lie, because usually lying is going to lead to less overall well-being in the world. But there might be exceptions where maybe telling a small lie, or maybe lying to an abuser about where a friend is, well, that might increase overall well-being in the world. And so in that situation, the utilitarian will say, well, now there's an exception, since really what matters is not that you're lying. What matters is whether you're maximizing well-being. And in this scenario, it just turns out that by breaking this conventional rule, you actually maximize well-being better. And so in that case, the right thing to do would be to lie. There's an exception in this scenario. Now, it thereby allows us to respond to the details of the situation. We should be able to treat different situations differently depending on those details, is the idea. Now, a lot of people think that what this means is that utilitarianism provides us a morality suited for the real imperfect world we live in. Look, in a perfect world, yeah, maybe it'd always be wrong to lie because there'd be no need to lie. But we don't live in a perfect world. We live in a world where there are bad people and there are bad things that happen and there are abusers. And they might sometimes come looking for information about where the people are that they want to abuse. We need a morality that lets us respond to the fact that we live in that imperfect world. We want a morality that helps us live in the actual world and not some idealized world that's far removed from anything we find ourselves actually in. So by allowing us to respond to the details of the situation, it allows us to maybe make the best of a bad situation. And now, moreover, it provides us with an impartial, objective standard of when these exceptions are allowed. You can't just make an exception for yourself because you don't want to do it. The exception depends on whether, by breaking that rule, you will actually maximize utility. So there's an objective standard that doesn't depend upon how you feel about it that determines when you can break those rules. Moreover, when moral rules might conflict with one another. For instance, you might think, here's one moral rule, tell the truth. Here's another moral rule, don't harm other people. Well, what if telling the truth would harm another person? Well, in this scenario, the idea is we need some way to resolve the conflict between those two rules. Utilitarianism gives us an objective standard to figure out which rule it would be right to follow in that situation. Whichever rule in that conflict would lead to the most overall well-being in the world, that's the one it's right to do in that situation. There is, however, one exception to all of this, because there is one and only one absolute moral rule on this theory, and that's the rule that says maximize utility. It is always wrong to break the rule that says maximize utility, according to this theory. I know another advantage here is it seems to provide us with clear guidance about how we can try to resolve moral disagreements. Imagine you overhear someone talking about some nasty gossip about someone behind their back. Someone might think that maybe you ought to go tell your friend about this nasty gossip. But another person might disagree because they might think that just might hurt their feelings, might hurt the group, etc. Well, who's right? Who's wrong? How do we decide in the case of this disagreement? Some controversies are even more difficult than that. Consider the disagreements about the morality of abortion, or consider the disagreements about the morality of capital punishment. Now, these conversations can go back and forth, and if you talk about them in terms of fairness, in terms of justice, etc., well, those concepts are abstract, they're vague, ambiguous, and there's different ways of trying to measure fairness, to try to measure justice, etc. And so it's not clear exactly how we could resolve those disagreements when people disagree about which action is fair or just. Well, utilitarianism bypasses all those controversies by saying, look, if you want to resolve this disagreement, we just need to figure out what the consequences of these actions are, and then compare the consequences to the other actions we could perform. Now, sometimes it can be difficult to figure out what the consequences of an action will be, but at the very least, we at least know how to go about that conversation. We know how to investigate that. And so it gives us a clear path of what to look at to resolve these disagreements. A final advantage here concerns what's known as the moral community. Utilitarianism seems to provide an inclusive account of the moral community. And what I mean by the moral community here, who or what do we need to give intrinsic consideration to when determining the morality of an action? My computer and car are not part of the moral community. So you don't need to give any intrinsic consideration to my computer or my car in trying to determine what the morally or immoral thing to do is. It might be wrong derivatively for you to destroy my computer because I care about my computer. But there, you're not giving any intrinsic consideration to my computer. You're giving consideration to how that computer affects me. You're giving consideration to me. I am part of the moral community, not my computer, not my car. On the utilitarian view, animals, such as my dog Jude, would be part of the moral community. You need to give intrinsic consideration to how your actions affect my dog's well-being. So something on this view will be a member of the moral community, will be worthy of intrinsic consideration if it is capable of experiencing pleasure or suffering. Utilitarianism still implies that it will sometimes be morally acceptable to do something that harms members of the moral community, since sometimes that might be the action that maximizes overall well-being. So, for instance, perhaps utilitarianism could still justify using animals in medical testing, because maybe by performing that medical testing on animals, we can thereby create more overall well-being in the world. That's a difficult question. The key point here, though, is just that the fact that something is part of the moral community doesn't mean that it's always wrong to do something that would harm them. Rather, what it means is that we need to take that harm into consideration for its own sake, when determining what the moral or immoral thing to do is when we make those kinds of calculations. That's all for this video introducing moral theories, consequentialism, and the advantages specifically of utilitarianism.